As I mentioned in my Romanesque and Gothic art lectures, Italy took a somewhat different path through the Middle Ages. Remnants of the Roman Empire lived on more strongly here, and of course Italian artists could actually study Roman sculpture firsthand. The areas of Europe that would eventually become France and Germany, these are the areas we were focusing on when we looked at Romanesque and Gothic art, they were ruled by kingdoms, the larger empires of the Carolingians and then Ottonians, and the smaller kingdoms that arose as these empires disintegrated and reformed. Italy, by contrast, was a collection of city-states. Some, like Naples and Milan, were basically small kingdoms, but others, including Pisa, Siena, and Florence, where we're going to focus most of our attention in this chapter, were republics. Now, that does not mean they were democracies. These city-states were all oligarchies, that is, they were ruled by the wealthy few. But these few were often merchants, not noblemen, and the trade they conducted gave them contact with the wider world. They were also dedicated patrons of art. It was in Italy that the first great work of literature in the vernacular, or commonly spoken language, appeared, Dante's Divine Comedy. As Byzantium came under more and more threat from the Ottoman Turks, moreover, Greek scholars fled to Italy and brought with them Greek classical texts that had largely disappeared from Western Europe. This revival of classicism is going to be very important in our next unit on the Renaissance, but we're going to see the first hints of it in this chapter. This altarpiece is painted in what was dubbed at the time the Maniera Greca, or Greek manner, and what art historians now call the Italo-Byzantine style. It was heavily influenced by the immigrants fleeing Byzantium that I just mentioned, who brought their art and artistic techniques with them. We're going to analyze the Byzantine elements of this painting in just a minute, but first I want to talk briefly about the Dominicans and Franciscans, two religious orders that transformed religious life, first in Italy and then throughout Europe. The Dominicans were a famous teaching order, and like the Franciscans, they focused their ministry on ordinary people. We're going to encounter the Dominicans later. For now, though, I want to focus on the order founded by St. Francis of Assisi in 1209. This painting dates, amazingly enough, from only 9 years after St. Francis's death, so it's a testament to the immediate and enormous impact this saint had on Christendom. I think most of you know about St. Francis, how he renounced his considerable worldly goods, and how he preached respect for God's natural creation. In Italy, huge congregations flocked to hear St. Francis and his followers preach. Rejecting abstract symbolism and complex theology, Franciscans preached in stories that brought the gospel quite literally down to earth. We're going to see this narrative captured most dramatically in the transformative art of Giotto. Now, the city of Assisi and the Basilica of San Francesco are completely missing from your textbook, which actually quite shocked me, especially since the Franciscans so influenced the art of Giotto, one of the most important painters we're going to study in this course. And we're going to be talking about him today, so pay attention. But if, as I keep recommending, you are keeping a list for future travels, put Assisi on the list. It is a really magical and I think deeply spiritually moving place. We've already so much to cover that's actually in the textbook that I probably shouldn't add anymore, but I just can't reconcile myself to cutting Assisi entirely out of the course. So we're going to take a quick Assisi break before returning to Bonaventura's painting. This huge church was built to hold the large congregations who came to hear Franciscans preach. While large, it is not, you'll note, at all Gothic in its style. The basilica's simplicity really echoes the gentle saint whom it honors. Its size, on the other hand, reflects the enormous attraction of his message. Okay, over the next couple of days, you're going to meet possibly my favorite art historian, a diminutive British nun, Sister Wendy Beckett, who has written widely on art and starred in a number of art history documentaries. This clip is from her Story of Painting series, which we'll see again. As I said, it's not the last Sister Wendy clip you'll see. She is a less technical and more spiritual commentator than most of the art historians we've looked at in this course. And maybe that's why I enjoy her so much. Buck teeth, lisp, and all. So here's a brief taste of Sister Wendy treats to come, her introduction to the Franciscans and their basilica at Assisi. We'll return to the basilica and Sister Wendy's tour of its art in our next lecture, although we'll see more of Sister Wendy today. Okay, I'm finally back to the St. Francis altarpiece in the Maniera Greca, or Italo-Byzantine style. So what Byzantine features do you observe? Well, the figure of St. Francis is fully frontal and elongated. He has that long, thin Byzantine nose and the wide, staring eyes. His feet seem to be floating on the surface, and the space he occupies is linear and flat. It's really not a three-dimensional space at all. The gold leaf indicates the state's otherworldly state, a little ironic for the very down-to-earth St. Francis, while the accompanying images tell stories from his life. In other words, this really looks a lot like an icon. One interesting historical and theological note, until Vatican II, priests generally celebrated Mass ad orientem, that is, with their faces to the east, which, given the orientation of most apses, usually meant with their backs to the congregation. Altarpieces came into fashion in part to give congregations something to contemplate during Mass besides the priest's posterior. So here are some of the small paintings that are down below the large image of St. Francis, famous scenes from St. Francis's life. And again, recall that this painting came very soon after the saint's death. Now, you all know the story of St. Francis preaching to the birds, right? And here he is receiving the stigmata, or wounds of Christ. This famous painting by Giotto, less than 70 years later, is also not included in your textbook. That was another surprise to me, since it's one of Giotto's most famous works. There's an excellent short Khan Academy podcast about this painting that, amazingly enough, I did not assign. But of course, I'm going to encourage you to watch it anyway. I've included the link here, and you can find it on Moodle as well. I know we haven't gotten to Giotto just yet, but what differences do you see between these two depictions of the same scene? Well, note that Giotto St. Francis actually has a body underneath his cloak. Both he and the figure of Christ have very human faces. The landscape, while hardly naturalistic, still bears a somewhat closer resemblance to nature. The painting is still, however, largely iconographic. We haven't arrived at the Renaissance yet. As I mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about classicism when we get to the true Renaissance after Christmas break. But in Italy, as I've already mentioned, classicism never really died out entirely. There was also a major revival of interest in Roman art in southern Italy during the mid-13th century. This pulpit by Nicola Pisano shows a heavily Roman influence. By the way, that's a man's name, in case you were wondering. Also, the eagle represents the evangelist John, who almost always appeared on lecterns, or at least in the form of his eagle. Now, your textbook does not include this particular panel from Pisano's pulpit, but I saw it in a lecture I watched on proto-Renaissance art, and it illustrates the Roman influence especially well. So what Roman elements do you see? Well, note the weightiness of the figures, the twisted horses' heads, the very clearly depicted horses, and the depiction of a processional. Those all echo Roman friezes. However, Mary is larger than life. This is hierarchy of scale, and the draperies are somewhat more angular and linear than one would find in Roman sculpture. That's really more Gothic in its influence. But the real reason I wanted to show you the picture of the Adoration of the Magi was this side-by-side comparison with a Roman sarcophagus that sat on the edge of Pisa's Cathedral Square. So a work of art that Pisano would have seen every day. Look at the seated woman, Phaedra from the Legend of Hippolytus, if you want to look it up, and then look again at Mary. Pisano sculpted his figure in reverse, but the models are clearly very similar, as is the composition of the work. Okay, this image does appear in your book. One interesting comment, which I picked up on that same lecture on proto-Renaissance art, is that proto-Renaissance sculptors and painters embraced naturalism when they were depicting animals much earlier than when they were depicting people. So look at the sheep in the corner. Niccolò Pisano's son was likewise a famous and accomplished sculptor. Father and son each sculpted a continuous narrative of the Annunciation and Nativity. You need to know that term, by the way, which you've encountered before. It means that the same work shows multiple scenes from a narrative. So, what difference does a generation make? What differences do you see between these two renderings of the same continuous narrative of the Annunciation and Nativity? Well, there's more movement in the younger Pisano sculpture and more expression in the faces. The figures are also more curved and dynamic. Again, we're getting closer to the Renaissance. So here's a bigger and closer look at the son's more dramatic and dynamic relief sculpture. Again, this is on a pulpit. Cimabue is probably the greatest Renaissance of the Italo-Byzantine style. And by the way, a question to that effect shows up frequently on AP tests. His work clearly reflects not only the influence of Byzantine icons, however, but also the influence of French Gothic sculpture, which we looked at in our last couple of lectures. Note the linear and elongated style of the drapery and also the tender depiction of the Virgin. This is much more Gothic. The architectural features at the bottom is Gothic as well. But what's most clearly marks this painting out as Gothic rather than Byzantine is actually its massive size. Byzantine artists used paint for smaller works, especially icons. A work of this size would be mosaic, not egg tempera on wood. The Byzantine elements and the departure from the Byzantine elements become clearer when you compare Cimabue's Madonna with the Byzantine Theotokos, or Mother of God icon. You saw this back in our Byzantine unit. Now, there are many facial similarities, but still the Byzantine Madonna is much more stylized, much more formal, much more unapproachable. Cimabue's reflects the worship of Mary as the Mother of God who would intercede for sinners with Christ, very much a Gothic theme. But that comparison is really less striking than the comparison between Cimabue and his most famous student, Giotto. The Giotto altarpiece is smaller. It's only 10 feet high as opposed to 16. But what other differences do you notice? Well, the architecture of the throne in the Giotto painting is real. It actually wraps around the Madonna, enclosing her. Her head is upright, which is a break from tradition. She looks at us, engaging us in the moment. The angels are likewise more varied and seem to stand more clearly on a ground plane. Okay, now let's hear from the experts. I suspect you think that I assign every Khan Academy video ever recorded. It ain't so. I saved this one to show you in class. I realize there is some repetition with what you've already seen, but the material is worth repeating. These two artists, but especially Giotto, represent very important developments in art history. Okay, we're finally honing in on Giotto. I'm not going to give you much background about the Arena Chapel since you've watched one video about this extraordinary masterpiece and are about to watch another. But please know that this is one of the works that you must be able to recognize and identify. Since it's very distinctive, I actually don't think that'll prove a very tough challenge. The Arena Chapel is found in Padua in northern Italy, which was another of those Italian trading cities that accumulated great wealth in this period. And on the Pod Academy podcast, you learned about its origin, basically an infamous moneylender whose father actually showed up in Dante's Inferno, not being treated very pleasantly in hell, basically commissioned this chapel as an effort to escape that fate. These photos show the two ends of the chapel, one depicting the Last Judgment, the other the Annunciation. Okay, we're heading back to Sister Wendy and a longer video clip. Don't worry about notes here. Just take in the beauty and artistry of these images. This is an extraordinary work of art. Well, you've already heard a lot about the paintings on the Arena Chapel, so I'm going to move pretty quickly now. Here are several of the images, starting with Christ's entry into Jerusalem. What really strikes me here is the vibrant narrative detail. This was the artistic equivalent of Franciscan preaching. Human, straightforward, rooted in the real world. Note the drama of the people removing their cloaks, and you see it as a process, and the man climbing the tree for a better view. The castle occupies real space. This truly is an artistic revolution. The architectural features that are included in the painting, by the way, notice around the corner and are characteristic of the arena chapel as a whole, which has faux marble, also has what look like gray statues painted in grillade or gray. Everything in the chapel is paint, but it's meant to give the impression of architectural features. So we're going to look at just a few images from the arena chapel. Of course, you've seen some of the videos as well. Here's Mary's father, Joachim, visited in a dream by an angel who announces the coming birth of a child. So again, note the modeling and the volume of both Joachim and the shed. Here, too, the animals are even more realistic than the human figures. I didn't even bother to label this one. You all recognize this scene, especially this time of year. Here, Mary, young and tender, reaches for a baby who looks, well, almost like a real baby. And here are the weeping angels again. Note how the figures overlap and stand planted on the ground. Again, Giotto really introduces art that captures actual places. Mary Magdalene is reaching to touch Jesus as the soldiers sleep, and he warns her not to touch him. I think the soldiers are particularly good here. Again, this is a picture that tells a story. And here we see Christ ascending into heaven. Again, with a real body modeled under his clothes, with overlapping figures below him showing three-dimensional space, and with a sense of movement that actually kind of breaks out of its frame, something we're going to see more of in later paintings. So here's the arena chapel's Lamentation, which is usually viewed as the greatest masterpiece of a chapel that's filled with masterpieces. Just a note about terms. Chiaroscuro means a contrast between light and dark, and it's used to create both three-dimensional modeling and a direction to direct our eye and emphasize certain elements of a painting. Giotto represents chiaroscuro at its very beginning. You may recall that we saw much more dramatic chiaroscuro, or contrast between dark and light, in Caravaggio's and Gentileschi's depictions of Judith and Holofernes. But it's a start. Likewise, the placement of figures in space that you see here is not really linear perspective yet. Nevertheless, these figures do exist in three-dimensional space, and that's a huge breakthrough. Finally, the composition of this painting is masterful. Note the figures with their backs to us. The line of the tomb, the solitary dead tree representing the fatal tree in Eden, whose curse is about to be overcome with Jesus' resurrection. This is painting with new drama. We see St. John the Evangelist flinging out his arms and drawing our attention to the diagonal line cut by the rocky tomb. The diagonal leads us to the focal point and climax of the composition, the grieving Mary holding her son. Notice, too, the movement of the grieving angels. They dive and plummet toward the scene below. They're not just pinned, if you will, to a gold wall. I'll close with the arena chapel's Last Judgment, the scene on the wall opposite the Annunciation. Unlike the Lamentation, this is not actually considered one of Giotto's greatest works. Art historians actually think that much of it was painted by his assistants. Giotto is really most brilliant when he's capturing narrative. This set piece reminds us that even though Giotto is in many ways ushered in Renaissance painting, note the term proto-Renaissance I've been using, he was still fundamentally a medieval Gothic painter. We've seen several Last Judgments in this unit, so you should recognize the characteristic elements. The saved and the damned below the cross, Christ in heaven surrounded by saints and angels. You may have noticed down at the bottom, the arena chapel's patron, Scrovegni, features prominently among the saved. Giotto knew who was writing his paycheck. So here we see, this is a close-up, here we see the patron presenting the chapel to the three Marys. I can hardly overstate the importance of the arena chapel. Before Giotto and this famous work, most artists were anonymous craftsmen. That's why this work made Giotto almost instantly famous. And after this, your life is going to get more complicated because we're going to be memorizing a lot more artists' names, and you're going to need to recognize works of art by their artists much more commonly. Artists came from all over Europe to study this chapel and Giotto's technique, and they all knew his name. We're turning a corner. But first, now, I love Sister Wendy. I own several of her books, and I've watched the entire Story of Painting series several times. I do not mean in any way to be disrespectful, but she is deliciously easy to parody. So as a final treat, here is Sister Wendy.